You are about to witness a legal chess match where a congresswoman walks in with fire, but a young press secretary walks out with the win. If you enjoy stories of strategy, restraint, and real consequences, this one's for you. The hearing room was built for order, not spectacle. But on this gray morning in New York City, it had become both. Cameras rolled silently from the press box, their red lights blinking like watchful eyes. Behind the long mahogany bench sat the National Infrastructure Oversight Commission, summoned in emergency session to investigate one of the most explosive allegations of financial misconduct since Hurricane Solomon tore through the Gulf. The accusation? That Harrison Vos, CEO of Nexus Build, the government's largest private infrastructure contractor, had funneled more than $5 million in federal disaster relief funds into shell companies tied to his personal estate. The stakes weren't just political, they were national. In the center of it all stood Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, her posture taut, her eyes fixed ahead. A former defense attorney turned firebrand progressive, she had built her career on courtroom victories and righteous crusades. Today was supposed to be her crescendo. She had the evidence, she had the moral high ground, and for a moment, it seemed she had the room. But then, in the far corner behind the defense table, a young woman stood. Blonde hair pulled tight, black suit immaculate, her presence subtle yet undeniable. Karoline Leavitt. Introduced not as counsel but as a special legal advisor from the White House, she wasn't supposed to speak, until she did. With calm precision, she asked a single question about the legality of Crockett's key recording. The room didn't gasp, but it didn't need to. Something had shifted. Viewers across the country leaned forward as the temperature in the room dropped a degree. In a nation divided by politics, fatigue, and distrust, this wasn't just another hearing, it was a battlefield of law and legacy, and America was watching. Hurricane Solomon wasn't just a weather event, it was a reckoning. When it made landfall on the Gulf Coast 2 years prior, it ripped through small towns and industrial zones with equal fury. Whole neighborhoods vanished, roads crumbled into sinkholes, bridges snapped like twigs. But while the storm passed in days, its aftermath lingered like a wound that refused to close. In the face of national outcry, Congress acted quickly, passing a sweeping emergency infrastructure package worth $38 billion. The goal was clear: rebuild stronger, rebuild faster, and restore faith in government. Contracts were handed out to top firms across the country, and among them one name rose to the top: Nexus Build, led by the charismatic and politically connected Harrison Vos. With sleek promotional videos and an army of lobbyists, Nexus Build promised not only efficiency but transparency. The administration touted it as a new era of public partnership. But behind the glossy press releases and ribbon cuttings, whispers began to circulate about delays, bloated invoices, and missing funds. At first, they were dismissed as noise. After all, rebuilding a region takes time. But when Lucas Denton, a senior financial auditor inside Nexus Build, filed a confidential report with the Federal Ethics Bureau, everything changed. Denton alleged that Vos had set up shell companies and used them to siphon federal funds meant for critical infrastructure into private accounts and luxury real estate. He included internal spreadsheets, correspondence, and, most damning of all, a secretly recorded board meeting in which Vos allegedly bragged about milking the feds dry. The story exploded across headlines. Public trust, already fragile, plummeted. Committee hearings were fast-tracked, and into this firestorm stepped Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, newly appointed to lead the Oversight Subcommittee on Disaster Funds. Known for her prosecutorial grit and unshakable presence, Crockett saw the Vos case not just as a matter of justice, but as a defining moment. She assembled a legal case bolstered by Denton's whistleblower file and secured subpoenas for Nexus Build's bank records and contracts. This wasn't just about one man, it was about accountability, government oversight, and reminding the American public that no one, no matter how wealthy or well-connected, could stand above the law. As the hearing date approached, pressure mounted. Conservative news outlets accused Crockett of staging a political stunt. Allies within Congress warned her not to go too far. Even some within her own party worried the evidence might be mishandled. But Crockett didn't flinch. She had the facts, she had the law, and in her mind she had already won. The only thing left was to deliver the final blow in a public hearing broadcast to millions. What she didn't know, what no one expected, was that the most formidable challenge wouldn't come from Voss or his attorneys. It would come from a voice no one had prepared for, the White House press secretary, stepping far outside her lane, armed not with emotion, but with surgical precision and a legal mind that no one saw coming. Jasmine Crockett had always been more than a politician. Long before she ever set foot in the halls of Congress, she was a courtroom brawler, an iron-willed defense attorney with a reputation for dismantling prosecutors one cross-examination at a time. Born and raised in a working-class neighborhood outside Houston, she knew the weight of injustice intimately. Her father was a union organizer, her mother a public school teacher who often bought supplies with her own paycheck. Crockett's rise wasn't handed to her, it was earned case by case, client by client. When she won her congressional seat, flipping a long-held district, many in Washington dismissed her as a loud progressive with a short shelf life, but within months it was clear. Crockett wasn't there to play games, she was there to make her mark. Her appointment to lead the Oversight Subcommittee on Disaster Funds came during a moment of political fragility. Faith in federal infrastructure spending was low, and allegations against Nexus Build were quickly becoming a national scandal. But for Crockett, this wasn't just another committee assignment, it was a crusade. She poured herself into the investigation with a lawyer's hunger and a soldier's focus. She met with Denton, the whistleblower, behind closed doors, verifying every detail of his claims. She worked late into the night with her team, scrutinizing every line of Nexus Build's contracts and tracing wire transfers through layers of LLCs. She didn't want speculation, she wanted facts that couldn't be ignored. And when she found them, she knew she had her opening salvo. A boardroom recording in which Harrison Voss, relaxed and laughing, outlined his scheme in stunning detail. "They threw us the keys," he said on tape, "and we drove the truck straight through the Treasury gates." Crockett's eyes had narrowed. That clip alone, she believed, could bury him. Combined with subpoenaed bank records and internal emails, she had built a mountain of evidence. Her legal instincts told her she was ready. Her political instincts told her the public was behind her. She saw this not only as a chance to bring down a corrupt tycoon, but to remind the American people why they sent her to Washington in the first place. In the days leading up to the hearing, she refined every line of her argument, practicing her delivery in front of aides like it was a courtroom trial. She wore a tailored navy blazer, a quiet nod to the law career that built her, and carried a flash drive in her pocket like a weapon. Cameras waited outside the commission building. Headlines speculated this could be the next major blow to government corruption. Her staff called it the Crockett Reckoning. But in her confidence, she made one miscalculation. She knew Harrison Voss would come armed with lawyers and lobbyists. She'd prepared for every legal counter-argument. What she hadn't prepared for was someone outside the courtroom playbook. Someone who didn't wear a lawyer's badge but carried the weight of an entire administration. A young woman with no bar license, no judicial role, and no reason to be feared. Until she opened her mouth and reshaped the battlefield. Jasmine Crockett, the rising star of Congress, was ready for war, but she hadn't counted on Karoline Leavitt being the one to set the first fire. To understand the storm brewing beneath the polished boardrooms of Nexus Build, one had to understand the man at its helm. Harrison Voss. With his salt-and-pepper hair, expensive suits, and polished Southern charm, Voss embodied the archetype of the post-crisis industrial hero. After Hurricane Solomon, he had become a household name, not for philanthropy, but for promising action when bureaucracy stalled. Nexus Build, under his leadership, secured nearly $2.2 billion in federal contracts to rebuild highways, bridges, and emergency shelter systems across 3 storm-ravaged states. Voss was often seen at press conferences flanked by governors and senators, smiling wide as bulldozers rumbled behind him. His slogan was simple: "We don't talk, we build." What no one knew at the time was just how much of that building extended to his own fortune. Behind the curtain of public praise and patriotic branding, the machinery of Nexus Build was running hot with corruption. Delays were mounting, invoices bloated, and contractors complained of misallocated resources. The red flags were there, but they were buried in a sea of bureaucracy, protected by layers of shell companies, middlemen, and legal opacity. That was until Lucas Denton, a senior financial auditor and internal compliance officer at Nexus Build, saw something he couldn't ignore. Denton wasn't a crusader. A soft-spoken man in his early 40s with a background in forensic accounting, he had worked his way up from regional offices to corporate headquarters. He'd always believed in the mission, until the numbers stopped adding up. What started as a routine audit turned into a revelation. Denton found patterns in the company's ledgers, massive fund transfers routed through offshore entities, inflated vendor payments made to LLCs that didn't seem to exist, and a discrepancy between federal disbursements and on-site expenditures. At first, he raised questions internally. He was told bluntly to focus on his lane. That was when he made a choice, one that would change his life. He began collecting data quietly, backing up spreadsheets, flagging emails, and eventually, against every instinct he had, recording an executive board meeting that would later become the most damning piece of evidence in the case. In that recording, Harrison Voss's voice was unmistakable, confident, relaxed, arrogant. "We overbill," he said with a chuckle, "and the feds say thank you. It's not theft if they gave it to you blindfolded." Denton knew he had gold, but he also knew what it would cost him. He filed a confidential disclosure with the Federal Ethics Bureau, invoking Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act. Within weeks, his house was swarmed with reporters. His name leaked to the press. Nexus Build issued a statement denying all wrongdoing but subtly accusing Denton of misrepresenting internal documents. The public reaction split down predictable lines. Some called Denton a hero, others called him a traitor to American industry. When Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett reached out personally, Denton was hesitant, but her approach was calm, focused, and deeply legal. She wasn't chasing a headline, she wanted a case that would hold under fire. With Denton's help, she compiled a dossier of emails, vendor lists, and digital forensics. The centerpiece? That single audio file. The smoking gun. Crockett believed it would not only expose Voss, but shatter the illusion that the private sector could police itself in times of national crisis. What neither of them anticipated, however, was that the file, while morally damning, could be legally fragile. In Denton's pursuit of truth, he may have stepped on a minefield of wiretap laws and federal admissibility standards, and all it would take was one sharp legal mind to exploit that gap. Enter Karoline Leavitt, ready to dismantle everything, not by discrediting the message, but by invalidating the method by which it was delivered. The morning of the hearing dawned clear but tense in New York City. Outside the Federal Commission building, reporters crowded behind barricades, cameras trained on the entrance, waiting for the storm to unfold indoors. Inside the hearing room, a heavy silence reigned, broken only by the soft shuffle of papers and the buzz of nervous energy. This was no ordinary session. The National Infrastructure Oversight Commission had summoned one of the largest audiences in its history. Senior members of Congress, legal experts, and department heads filled the chamber's oak-lined benches. At the front, presiding over the hearing with measured authority, sat Commissioner Raymond Hall, a former federal judge known for his zero tolerance for theatrics. On one side of the room, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, standing tall at the head of her team, flanked by aides and folders marked confidential. On the other, Harrison Voss, calm and unmoved, sitting with his arms crossed, whispering occasionally to his lead counsel, Preston Shaw. The stage was set. The commission chair gave the nod and Crockett rose. Dressed in navy, with her notes laid out in neat order, she walked to the center of the chamber like a prosecutor stepping into closing arguments. Her tone was cool but firm as she laid out her opening statement. Nexus Build had received over $2 billion in emergency federal funds, yet critical infrastructure projects remained incomplete or poorly constructed. Then she began to lay out the timeline, supported by screenshots of wire transfers, shell corporations, and fraudulent vendor agreements. The press leaned forward, scribbling notes as images and graphs appeared on screens across the chamber. But it wasn't just data. Crockett spoke with conviction. This wasn't a political maneuver, this was a moral stand. Then came her moment. She held up a slim USB drive between her fingers, letting the morning light catch it like it was a relic of truth. "What I'm about to play," she announced, "is a direct recording from inside Nexus Build's executive boardroom. You will hear Harrison Voss in his own words admitting to misusing taxpayer money." The room buzzed. Commissioner Hall adjusted his glasses. On cue, one of Crockett's aides approached the console to cue up the audio. "That's when it happened." A voice, crisp and composed, cut through the chamber. "Mr. Chairman, before this recording is played, I request that its admissibility be formally reviewed under federal law." Heads turned. A young woman, previously seated quietly behind Voss's legal team, now stood at full height. Her voice was calm but carried authority. Karoline Leavitt, special legal advisor to the defense, appointed by the Office of the White House Counsel. Commissioner Hall blinked. Crockett turned sharply, brows furrowed. Leavitt stepped forward slowly, a thin folder in hand. "This recording may constitute a violation of federal and state wiretap laws," she continued. "Its entry into the record without proper consent or court order would jeopardize the legitimacy of this proceeding." For a moment, the room fell into stunned silence. Reporters exchanged frantic glances. Preston Shaw said nothing, his eyes locked on Leavitt with a flicker of surprise and something else. Respect. Crockett narrowed her gaze. This was unexpected. She had faced down seasoned litigators and media blowhards, but she hadn't prepared for Karoline Leavitt, a press secretary with no law degree now standing between her and her perfect takedown, armed not with outrage, but with cold, meticulous legal language. And in that moment, the hearing transformed. What had begun as a simple presentation had just become a battlefield. There was something disarming about the way Karoline Leavitt stood. No fanfare, no rush, just calm, a stillness that unnerved the room more than a loud objection ever could. Dressed in a charcoal gray suit and standing barely 5'5", she didn't command the room with height or volume, but with presence. Leavitt had sat silently through the first part of the hearing, scribbling occasional notes in the margins of her folder, unmoved by the rising momentum behind Jasmine Crockett's case. But now, with one sentence, she had seized the floor and the spotlight. "Mr. Chairman, I request the Commission examine the admissibility of the proposed audio evidence under federal law." Even Commissioner Hall raised an eyebrow. It wasn't just the timing, it was the authority in her voice. She didn't speak like someone seeking permission. She spoke like someone who already understood the boundaries of the law and had come to hold the room accountable to them. Jasmine Crockett looked stunned. Her eyes darted from Leavitt to the panel, confusion flaring into disbelief. "Excuse me," she said, turning halfway in her seat. "Is this some kind of stunt?" Leavitt didn't blink. "No stunt, Congresswoman," she replied, voice steady. "Just the law." It was the first time Crockett had felt the rhythm shift. She'd expected opposition from Voss's attorneys, objections she had prepared for and preempted, but this was something else entirely. Leavitt wasn't using theatrics. She was slicing through the proceedings like a scalpel. Commissioner Hall gestured for Leavitt to proceed. The room, moments earlier roaring with the anticipation of a dramatic audio reveal, now listened in a kind of breathless quiet. "The recording in question, as introduced by Congresswoman Crockett," Leavitt began, "was captured without the knowledge or consent of Mr. Voss. According to Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 2511, this constitutes a violation of the Federal Wiretap Act unless one party consents or there is judicial approval. Texas law where the recording was made further requires consent from both parties in private communication." Crockett interjected. "He was under federal investigation. This was an act of whistleblowing, not surveillance." Leavitt nodded politely. "And whistleblowers under 5 U.S. Code Section 2302 are protected from retaliation, not from evidentiary standards. The distinction matters. Protection ensures Mr. Denton can't be fired for speaking out. It does not, however, make the evidence he submitted automatically admissible, especially if it violates consent laws." As she spoke, her tone was measured, almost surgical. She didn't argue. She cited. She didn't raise her voice, she referenced case law. Her delivery wasn't that of a lawyer trained by courtrooms, it was that of a communicator trained in public messaging, sharpened by years of verbal combat from White House podiums. What Crockett had not realized was that Karoline Leavitt didn't need a law degree to wield the law. She needed clarity, confidence, and the right statutes, and she had all three. The commission began murmuring. One aide to the panel leaned toward Commissioner Hall and whispered something urgently. Across the aisle, Harrison Voss remained calm, but now a small smile pulled at the corner of his lips. He didn't need to speak. He didn't even need his own lawyers. Leavitt had just shifted the dynamic of the room entirely, placing doubt where there had been certainty. Crockett looked down at the USB still in her hand, her weapon now being questioned before it even had a chance to strike. And Karoline Leavitt? She returned to her seat slowly, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred, but everyone in that room knew something had. A press secretary had stood, spoke once, and already, the ground beneath Jasmine Crockett's feet was beginning to shake. The silence that followed Karoline Leavitt's objection was heavy, like a courtroom caught off guard by an unforeseen cross-examination. Jasmine Crockett, still standing near the evidence table, gripped the USB drive tighter in her hand. Just moments earlier, it had felt like a weapon, a hammer of truth meant to crush a corrupt executive in front of a nation hungry for accountability. Now, it felt uncertain. "This is a federal oversight hearing," Crockett said, attempting to reclaim the momentum. "The American people deserve to hear that recording." She turned to Commissioner Hall. "The content speaks for itself." But Leavitt, remaining seated with a thin smile, simply raised a finger to request the floor again. The commissioner granted it. "This isn't about content," Leavitt began, her tone even. "It's about process. And if we compromise process in the name of outrage, we no longer serve justice, we serve spectacle." She opened her folder and lifted a single page, clearly marked with federal statute headings. "The Federal Wiretap Act, Title 18 U.S.C. SS 2511, she read aloud, states that it is illegal to intercept or disclose any wire, oral, or electronic communication, unless one of the parties consents or judicial authorization is obtained." She paused for a beat. "But in the state of Texas, where this recording was made, both parties must consent for such a recording to be lawful. That is not a federal technicality, it is a state statute. Without that consent or a court-issued order, the recording is inadmissible, regardless of what is on it." Crockett tried to interrupt. "The Whistleblower Protection Act..." Leavitt didn't raise her voice, she simply spoke over the interruption with surgical clarity. "The Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act protects employees from retaliation, Congresswoman. It does not immunize them from evidence laws. You are confusing shield with sword." The room shifted again. Crockett blinked, clearly thrown, not just by the objection itself, but by the precision with which Leavitt wielded it. She hadn't expected the young press secretary to be this fluent in statute, not just quoting law, but interpreting its application. Leavitt continued, "Even if the recording is morally damning, it is legally toxic. Admitting it into the record opens this entire hearing to judicial challenge. Do you really want this committee's work undone in federal court due to improper evidence procedure?" The question landed hard, not just with Crockett, but with the panel. One of the senior commissioners leaned over to whisper into Hall's ear. Across the room, a few members of the press began typing furiously. The spectacle had shifted. No longer was the headline "Whistleblower Brings Down Tycoon." Now it flirted with, "Congresswoman's star evidence may be illegal." Crockett stepped forward, her voice louder, more forceful. "Are we really going to let a press secretary redefine federal standards? She's not a judge. She's not even an attorney." But the words felt hollow, defensive. The strength she had carried into the room was cracking. "No," Leavitt replied, still calm. "I'm not a judge, but I read the law and I'm quoting it accurately. If I'm wrong, correct me. But if I'm right, this recording has no place in this hearing." Commissioner Hall looked out over the room. His face was still, unreadable. But his next words made the impact undeniable. "Until the legality of this recording is confirmed," he said, "it will not be played. The Commission will not risk procedural compromise." Crockett froze, her eyes locked on the USB. A piece of evidence she believed would shake the country had just been silenced without ever being heard. And Karoline Leavitt had landed her first strike. Clean, clinical, devastating. With the recording excluded for now, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett moved swiftly to regain her footing. Though rattled by Karoline Leavitt's unexpected legal precision, she wasn't about to surrender the floor. With a sharp breath and a flick of her wrist, she turned to the second pillar of her case, the financial documents. Even without the recording, she declared to the room, "We have hard evidence. These are bank statements, contract invoices, and ledger entries, all tracing the flow of federal funds directly into shell corporations tied to Mr. Voss. The paper trail doesn't lie." She handed a thick stack of documents to the commission clerk as large digital copies appeared on the monitors around the room. The charts and transaction flows were clear and damning. Tens of thousands wired to accounts registered in the Cayman Islands, payments to construction companies that didn't exist, and a pattern of systematic diversion dating back 18 months. For a moment, the balance seemed to tilt back in Crockett's favor. Members of the commission leaned in, a few murmured to one another. The press's interest reignited. Even Commissioner Hall gave a slight nod of interest. But then, just as Crockett reached for her closing point, Karoline Leavitt raised her hand once more, calm, methodical, dangerous. "Mr. Chairman, before these documents are entered as evidence, I ask the Commission to confirm one detail," she said. "Were these materials obtained through a properly authorized federal subpoena?" Crockett's expression hardened. "Of course they were," she snapped. "The committee subpoenaed Nexus Build's internal financial records weeks ago." Leavitt offered a tight smile, then stepped forward holding a single page, this time a copy of the subpoena itself. She walked to the commission clerk's desk and handed it over. "I obtained a duplicate of the subpoena from the committee's public record," she said, "and with all due respect, there appears to be a serious procedural flaw." The room stiffened. Commissioner Hall adjusted his glasses. "Clarify your point, Ms. Leavitt." Leavitt gestured to the bottom corner of the page. "As you can see, the subpoena was signed not by a sitting federal judge or the committee chair, but by a staff clerk. Under Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 45, only a judge or properly authorized legal officer can issue a subpoena with the power to compel private records, especially involving sensitive financial data. A clerk's signature, even from within the committee, carries no legal weight in this context. Therefore, these documents were collected without enforceable authority." A murmur swept through the room. Crockett snatched the document from the clerk and scanned the signature. Her brows furrowed. It was true, signed by a committee staff clerk, not the chair, and certainly not a judge. Her voice rose slightly. "This is a technicality. The clerk acts on the authority of the committee." But Leavitt shook her head. "Respectfully, Congresswoman, the law does not bend for convenience. Without a proper signature, these documents are tainted. Any evidence derived from them is legally challengeable and ethically questionable." Preston Shaw, Voss's lead counsel, finally spoke for the first time. "We concur with Ms. Leavitt. We formally request the exclusion of the financial documents from the hearing record due to improper subpoena procedure." Hall held up a hand to silence the room. He turned to Crockett, his tone calm but firm. "Do you have anything to counter this claim?" Crockett stood frozen. She had spent weeks preparing this case, and in the span of 15 minutes, Karoline Leavitt had neutralized her two strongest weapons, not with flair, but with the dull, merciless edge of legal procedure. The room fell into a tense hush as Commissioner Hall reviewed the subpoena himself. Across the aisle, Leavitt returned to her seat, not triumphant, but composed. For her, it wasn't a victory. It was just another step in a long, quiet dismantling. Crockett's armor was cracking, and everyone in the room could see it. For a woman known for her composure under pressure, Jasmine Crockett now found herself teetering on a precipice she had never imagined. As Commissioner Hall silently reviewed the subpoena in his hand, the weight of the moment pressed down on her like a collapsing roof. Two of her strongest evidentiary weapons, the whistleblowers, recording, and the financial documents, hadn't just been questioned, they had been strategically gutted in full view of the public, the press, and the very oversight body she thought she commanded. And not by a judge, not by an attorney, but by Karoline Leavitt, A woman she had dismissed at first glance as just another political mouthpiece. Now, the once commanding Congresswoman stood behind her table, shoulders tense, jaw clenched, her eyes flicking between the commissioners and the blinking red lights of the cameras broadcasting her unraveling across the country. She tried to fight back. "Are we really going to let procedural footnotes get in the way of exposing corruption?" she demanded, her voice rising, cracking slightly under the strain. "The law is here to serve justice, not to protect men like Harrison Voss from accountability." Her words, though passionate, felt rushed, blurred by frustration rather than guided by strategy. She turned toward Leavitt, who remained seated, expression unreadable, eyes cool and focused. "You're twisting the law," Crockett snapped, pointing a finger. "You're not a lawyer. You're a spokesperson pretending to be something you're not, here to run cover for a criminal." Leavitt's response came without hesitation, her voice low but cutting. "I don't have to pretend to know the law, Congresswoman," she replied. "I simply read it. If your team missed a critical step, that's not my deception, that's your oversight." The blow landed sharper than Crockett expected. She froze. The room did too. Even Voss, silent for most of the hearing, shifted slightly in his chair, clearly savoring the moment. Crockett turned away, gripping the edge of the table as if bracing for a wave. She had spent weeks building this case, preparing her arguments, perfecting her presentation, certain of her victory. But the structure she built, brick by brick, was now crumbling in front of her, with Leavitt dismantling each cornerstone, using nothing more than logic and language. Her aide, Dr. Talia Monroe, leaned in and whispered something, an attempt to ground her, to remind her of the bigger picture. But Crockett barely heard it. Her mind buzzed with disbelief. The headlines she imagined this morning were fading. In their place, new ones were forming. Congresswoman's case falters under legal fire. White House press secretary silences oversight star. And what stung most wasn't just the procedural defeat, it was that she had underestimated her opponent. She hadn't seen Leavitt as a threat until it was too late. As the hearing recessed for 15 minutes, the noise in the room swelled. Crockett stood still, her hands planted firmly on the table, her breath shallow. She didn't look up as Leavitt passed behind her, but she could feel the quiet, deliberate confidence in every step. The first round was over, and Jasmine Crockett had been outmaneuvered, not by power, not by partisanship, but by precision. The hallway outside the commission chamber was cold and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos left behind. Reporters had swarmed elsewhere, chasing statements and headlines, leaving a rare moment of silence between the two women at the center of the storm. Jasmine Crockett stood by a narrow window, her back to the room, a half-empty cup of water in her hand. She stared at the distant city skyline, her expression unreadable. Footsteps echoed softly behind her. Measured, unhurried, Karoline Leavitt approached, not as a press secretary on camera, but as something more formidable, the woman who had just unraveled a congressional case without ever raising her voice. Crockett turned slowly. "I'll give you this," she said, voice low, edged with reluctant respect. "You're good, damn good." Leavitt offered the faintest smile, not smug, but precise. "You didn't expect me to be," she replied. "No one ever does, until they have to." The two women stood in stillness, the buzz of the city bleeding faintly through the glass. Crockett studied her rival. No podium, no cameras, just a young woman who had turned procedure into power. "I thought you were just a puppet," Crockett muttered. "Turns out, you're the one pulling strings." Leavitt tilted her head slightly. "I'm not pulling anything. I'm just prepared. You came here with emotion. I came with law." There was no gloating in her voice, only certainty. For the first time that day, Crockett didn't feel anger. She felt warning. This wasn't just a press secretary playing defense. This was a political weapon in the making. "Next time," Crockett said as she turned to leave. "I'll be ready." Leavitt didn't flinch. "I'm counting on it," she said softly. The war wasn't over. It had only just begun. The commission reconvened with a tension that hung like fog. Commissioner Hall returned to the bench with the subpoena still in his hand, his face drawn, his voice calm but decisive. "At this time," he announced, "the Commission will withhold entry of both the recording and the financial documents pending legal review. This hearing is not closed, but it is paused." A wave of murmurs swept the room. For Jasmine Crockett, it was a devastating punctuation mark on what was supposed to be her public triumph. She didn't speak. She didn't argue. She simply gathered her files, eyes lowered, jaw tight. The press, already buzzing, began forming new headlines. Evidence blocked. Oversight stalled. Across the chamber, Karoline Leavitt sat motionless, her hands folded neatly, her expression unreadable. She had not come to win applause. She had come to enforce precision, and she had succeeded. Outside, as cameras flashed and microphones swarmed, Leavitt didn't grandstand. She stepped before the press with only one sentence: "The law must always outlast emotion." Then she turned and walked away, leaving the soundbites and spin to others. Meanwhile, back in her congressional office, Crockett sat in silence, her aide Talia Monroe quietly closing the door behind her. She stared at the documents spread out on the table, papers that now felt like relics of a plan undone by a single oversight. "I underestimated her," she said quietly, "and I won't do that again." This wasn't just a procedural defeat, it was a reminder of the battlefield Congress had become. Not of shouting matches or televised rage, but of cold strategy, silent rules, and quiet minds sharper than steel. Karoline Leavitt had not needed a title or robe to win the day. She had needed only the law and the discipline to wield it with precision, and in doing so she had proven a truth older than politics. Power may impress, but law decides. This story is a powerful reminder that in a world dominated by noise, posturing, and political spectacle, true influence lies in discipline, preparation, and precision. Jasmine Crockett, a seasoned congresswoman with law experience and moral clarity, entered the hearing believing that facts alone would win the day. But she underestimated the quiet force of Karoline Leavitt, a press secretary with no law degree, only a sharp mind and a mastery of the rules. Leavitt didn't need to shout. She didn't need to argue on emotion. She simply knew the law better, and she used it like a blade. The lesson is clear: power without precision is fragile, and emotion without structure, no matter how righteous, can collapse under the weight of well-aimed logic. In the arena of public accountability, it's not enough to be right, you must also be prepared. This story teaches us that legal battles, like life itself, are often won not by those who speak the loudest, but by those who understand the system deeply, anticipate every move, and strike with quiet certainty. In a time where truth often feels drowned out, this tale is a call to sharpen our minds, not just our voices.